Jesus bread! Yeah, my mask is locked, so I can't breathe through my mask. But I've got another one though. Ow!
Oh, there's not many people here. That's a shame. Never mind. So I wanted to open with that little video. It's from headcam footage taken in the Australian bushfires a couple of years ago. I like it because I think it hopefully creates a connection between us and you and the people who experienced that fire. That young lady is about 18 years old. She was fighting to save her family home from encroaching flames of the fire. The fire subsumed her home and it disappeared. She learned about the realities of the climate emergency firsthand by having to fight for her home. We're going to learn about the realities of the climate emergency in a slightly different mode, but I guess it's my express intention to try and create as much empathy between us and that young lady as possible during the space of this session. Emergency. So the planetary boundary is climate change, but I think much more appropriate language is talking about global heating, climate breakdown, social collapse, and as a result, using the language of a climate emergency. With the people next to you, and or kind of, at some kind of distance, could you just have a 30-second chat? When you think of the word emergency, what does it make you think of? Go for it. Right. What have you got for me? When I say the word emergency, you say emergency. Hurry. 999. That's the emergency services action number for people who don't know. I hope you do. What else? Please. Urgency. Anything else? Why do we care? Like, why are we hurrying to pick up the phone, to ring 999, to call for help? To try and save someone's life, to try and help ourselves, other human beings. It is a situation of immediate impending danger to us and other people, and therefore we need to do something about it. That's normally what an emergency is. Anyone wake up to the news headlines this morning? Another emergency that's happening in our world. Apparently we're going to go to war soon. That'll be fun, won't it? Say again? Can they just not do that, please? Yes. And if everyone could write a letter that says that, we might, yeah, who knows? This is an emergency, and politicians are falling over themselves to go and be part of it, to intervene, to do something good, even though they have an absolutely catastrophic record of successful achievement in this area. They're up for it this time, getting on the plane as fast as possible. Note the use of the word plane. Okay, this is how we tend to respond to emergencies. And what I want to do is kind of contrast this idea with the way the world is responding to what we think is a climate emergency. Just before I start, I just want to embed you in another audio-visual experience to try to maybe extend our visceral understanding of what a climate emergency is. So I've got some other footage from the bushfires. Woo. Ooh. I don't know how this works. It's this mouse. It's this.
We are going to get pumping here. Actually, we are near the head of this fire. Get up here. Here it comes, the head's coming. Nick, slow down. Can you get it? It's got to get you up there. We're going to go into burn over very, very quickly. Here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. Get the fucking front in. Burn over, Scotty, burn over. Burn over, Scotty. Fuck me! Jesus Christ! Jesus fucking Christ! Burn over! General broadcast, if any units are out. I've activated Modo. Who's at the back? Road, bullshit.
So those were some other people that experienced the forest fires in Australia a couple of years ago. Those are the professionals that turned up when we rang 999. The climate emergency means situations like that trained professionals are utterly and rightly, absolutely terrified of, with no ability to respond. Well, not no ability. Their response is a very human response. We're not set up for this. And this is what is happening and will happen if we don't take action. Just to connect this together a little bit intellectually, this is really important. It is categorically irrigorous to say that this was caused by climate change. It's much more complicated than that. Bushfires happen naturally. Arguably, they're actually a really important function of ecosystems. It's how certain seeds get spread, etc. However, the science suggests that where you have the global average temperature increasing, the conditions for these sorts of events are kind of exacerbated. Therefore, the frequency and intensity of such events is likely to increase. And of course, we've got other things going on, other human interventions into the environment. So some fires are started by humans through accident or deliberate act. But in where the conditions, the ecological conditions have changed, the average temperature is warmer, it intensifies things. And if the last video didn't show you the implications for human health, or the previous two videos, there is also a huge volume of peer-reviewed evidence that says, in general, if the climate continues to change in the way we think it will, and these bushfire events and other wildfire events continue, there is a serious impact on human health. So this is directly linked back to the Human Development Agenda. Right. So you're all sitting there a bit stunned, which I'm pleased about because that's what I wanted to happen. Because I think that's the mode in which we need to engage with the realities of how all this works. So I want to start at the beginning. Now, I know one or two, I think maybe three people looked at this on Moodle before I managed to withdraw it. So apologies to those people. It's going to be a slight revision. But I just want to talk about starting at the basics. So the greenhouse effect. And you've all submitted some suggestions about what you currently understand that to mean. And I just want to now to sort of plug, hopefully, some new information into that. But first of all, just a question. Any thoughts when we first collectively, as a human species, started to think about the relationship between carbon dioxide and the idea of a greenhouse effect, that it could trap heat in some way? Has anyone got any ballpark thoughts? A decade, a century? 2000s? 1970s? 50s, yeah. Say again, 1950s. Any other thoughts? And it's perfectly fine to guess, please. 1863. You sound like you might know more about this. Could you tell us a bit more? Ah, yes, I think I did. Good memory. Good learning. Yeah. So this goes way back. So actually, well, I may well have said that, but I think the current, or this bit of information suggests 1856, but it's a lot longer ago than most people think. Do you know the other thing that almost nobody knows about this scientific discovery? It was made by a woman. Back in the day when women had so little access to be involved in science, they were formally excluded by the patriarchy. We have a woman to owe a great debt to in terms of advancing knowledge at this level. So a little bit, I think it was Female Empowerment Day or something last week. So the economics department ran a big thing about the female contributions to collective understanding. So this is my addition to that. And let's dumb it down quite a bit from where they started then. Let's talk about our Earth, which currently is the only place in the universe we think we can exist as a species due to the conditions and resources that are available. And one of the resources available is energy coming in from the sun. It comes in a whole variety of wavelengths, and different things happen to it depending on what's going on. So some of it never makes it in, kind of hits water vapor and clouds, gets radiated back out, or kind of absorbed within the chemistry of what's going on in clouds. But some of it makes it through. When it hits the Earth's surface, a number of things can happen depending on where it hits and what's going on. In some cases, it will be absorbed. Well, in some cases, it will be bounced straight back out. In some cases, it will be absorbed and then radiated back out. And this is really important because where the energy is absorbed and then radiated back out, it changes the nature of the energy. So it changes the wavelength, which means that different things happen to it when it's heading out. And this is why one of the key concepts that we need to understand is that of albedo. Now, does anyone maybe have any access to knowledge about what albedo is? Freya?
Isn't it like the absorption and reflection, and just like, you know how in the summer if you're wearing like a black jumper, it gets really hot, and it's why people in quite hot countries normally wear like 90 colours.
Yes, absolutely. So albedo is the measurement of reflection, kind of technically, but by implication. Therefore, it helps us understand absorption. And exactly as Freya tells us, the lighter colours will tend to reflect more, which is exactly why you have white clothes, white houses in hot countries. Darker colours, because of the way they respond to the incoming energy, will absorb. And this is, so another way of thinking about this is why if you go skiing, you'll wear sunglasses because the intensity of the energy coming in is really strong. You need to protect your eyes. You'll wear cold weather clothes because it's really cold. And that's how those two things fit together, because the energy is very strong, it's coming in, it's hitting the white snow, and it's reflecting straight back out. So it's not actually getting that involved in the Earth's energy balance. It's, well, certainly in the surface energy balance. This is also why cats love to lie on tarmac, because it's nice and warm. And if you want something to stay warm, you'll generally use a dark colour. So nice. Remember albedo, it's important for some of the other online activities that you'll be doing in the week. So see if you can connect with that. If this was just the way our planet was, the planet would be really, really cold. We know this because we can look at other planets in our solar system and beyond and do measurements and look at conditions and say, well, this is how our energy balance would be if this is all we had. But fortunately, we've had this thing called the greenhouse. So this is where some of you might have put this in your initial forum posts, but I just want to build that slightly bigger context of information. To some of my groups last week, we talked about how there's like maybe the central information that you think is definitely relevant. Oh, it's a microphone. And then there's sort of information around the outside that might not be so core, but actually is really useful to understand it. And particularly when you present it to other people, so they don't just go, oh, but this doesn't make sense. You preemptively try to get them to understand. So this is, I think, useful in talking to people about the climate emergency. The Earth has a natural greenhouse, and this is a good thing. What this means is that the energy that gets radiated back out with a different wavelength gets caught by the greenhouse, so some of which is the carbon dioxide gas. Some of it escapes, but some of it gets trapped back in. And this is why our planet isn't really, really cold. So we have this naturally occurring process. And this is one of the many wonderful ecosystem services. So it could be a regulating ecosystem service, I guess, because it's maintaining a stable temperature. We could also think about it as a supporting service, because it supports lots of other things. But it's because of this we have had any chance of this kind of safe operating space for human development and all the wonderful things that we hold dear. So this is good. But, as we know, our happy humans here, pleased to be living in the safe operating space, are not always as aware and responsible as maybe they could be. And what humans have done is use this opportunity to undermine, as we know, a lot of ecosystem services, including our planet's average temperature, through loads of activities, and that should make us sad. It took me ages to get that math to work. I'm pleased with that. So this is then a second kind of greenhouse, and some people call it sort of human exacerbated greenhouse effect, or anthropogenic greenhouse, or kind of accelerated, but it's really useful to differentiate between what's there anyway and the additional effect that humans have had. Ooh, I think I was going to ask you a question. That's why the question mark was there. But to continue the fun of my animations, I've got the NASA, I think it's like first grade, learn about climate change card collection. So these are the greenhouse gases. And there's another one that I want to add to the set, because this is a degree level course, not first year kindergarten or whatever you call it. HCFCs, so hydrocarbon, hydrochlorofluorocarbons. Doesn't matter if you can't say it, you can still be an academic. So this is important because, as some of you got round to thinking about last week, these were initially a super-duper replacement for the normal CFCs. But what has then subsequently been realized is, as well as the CFCs also being a greenhouse gas, as well as destroying the ozone, the replacement for them is also a reasonably powerful greenhouse gas. So when we're thinking about interactions between kind of ozone and its governance and climate change, bear this in mind. So this is pretty much all of them. Does anyone have any thoughts or know which is the greenhouse gas we are generally most concerned about? What's the one that makes most of the headlines? Please. CO2. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts as to why we focus on that?
That one is the one that we can only contribute directly to our actions through fossil fuel burning.
Yeah, definitely. So this is, we are really responsible for emissions of this, and this is, I think, part of the reason. Please, Jane. Yes. you are right. So methane is more, unit for unit, methane is much more potent.
Is there also an area we focus on carbon dioxide? It's probably one with quite a simple solution to prevent. Because like through planting more trees and stuff, we can kind of reverse its effect.
Yeah, so taking the confined context of kind of CO2, that makes sense, it's engageable with. But I think it's a combination of these things. So CO2, although unit per unit, its global warming potential is lower than methane, there's much more of it, and we produce much more of it. So actually, this is the main driver from human activity of global heating, as far as we understand it. So yes, these two get bigger because they're important. So we can look here. So these are, what is this? So this is radioactive forcing. So this is kind of how much any one thing is contributing to changing the energy balance, and then as a consequence, kind of messing with the global average temperature. And we can see here that, so the thing that's messing with the system most is the CO2, and then followed by the methane. And then interestingly, so the CFCs are quite significant. And we've got some others as well. But CO2 is the reason we're concerned, we put most focus on, is because it's having the biggest effect. This graph is very old, but it tries to start to help us understand the impact that human activity has had. So if we take the Industrial Revolution, so it's sort of 1800s, 1860 type of thing, we start to see that the concentrations of these gases increase significantly in comparison with the sort of the previous time when humans weren't doing Industrial Revolution things. Please. Yes, that's a really good question. So the other variable in thinking about what's important is how long it, not just the potency, but how long it sticks around. And so I'm unsure. But I think, first of all, this is definitely a factor, and I think this might be correct. We will check it out. Nice, thank you. Yes, so that's the general pattern. The other interesting thing when we look back across history, we look at global average temperatures as far as our records are able to, we look at CO2 concentrations specifically, and we also look at sea levels, we see a relationship. And of course, correlation and patterns does not mean that it is a causal interaction. So this alone doesn't probably worry us. But when we start to put together the theoretical ideas developed going way back to the 1850s, 1860s, and we can observe empirically in a laboratory in a confined context what CO2 does to energy and to a temperature of a system, we can then start to be more confident that actually these patterns that look like they track one another are likely to have a causal interaction. Not just in one direction, but in other directions as well. So therefore, it might be relevant to observe that looking at the global average temperature for the most recent time, I'm not quite sure when this graph is also quite old, so I'm not quite sure when this is, but it's recent about now in the big picture of things. If we look back, the temperature has been warmer. And actually, therefore, it's okay, isn't it? I've just realized we can stop. This is not unprecedented average temperatures. It'll be fine. Or will it? Please.
We don't necessarily know that it's peaked at this point, like it could just continue to rise, whilst we've seen historically that it goes in peaks and troughs, whilst it could just continue to accelerate.
Yeah, absolutely. So where is this going? Is it just going to drop again, as we can see in the past, or is this going to keep going? Yeah.
Concentration line on the far right has gone up into the other graph, which means it's like highest levels
Yes, that's right. And also just to think about the complexities of interactions, just to throw in another important variable, I guess, time. It takes a while for any gas released into the system to start to have an effect. So there's a sort of there's a lag time between things getting emitted and also things being present and them having the effect that they will have. So this is also important. We think that there's some sort of relationship probably between global temperatures, CO2, and sea levels. So then the interesting thing to do, if you say, okay, well, but it's been warmer before, we go, okay, yeah, it has been. Where were sea levels at that time? What would that mean for your beach house? What would that mean for New York? What would that mean for London? Suddenly, the fact it's just happened before becomes less of a positive thing and more of a quite bad thing, because we go, oh, we can see what happened, and we can see how now humans have the cities they have, which didn't exist then. Like, we can start to see the implications. So this is sort of building our concern for the idea that it's an emergency. We're going to deal with this throughout the week, particularly in the learning resources on Moodle. But there are a lot of people who say, well, it's probably not humans. It's very arrogant to say that it's human activity. It's also wrong. There's not maybe enough evidence. And it's important for us to be confident. If we're going to label this as an emergency, we better be right, because we don't want to get it wrong, because there are literally wars going on and people dying. And if we're wasting our time on the climate emergency and it's not real, that's a problem. But just one of the possible more original kind of objections were that, I always talk about my mum. She always talks about things she learnt in school, what I'm telling her about peer-reviewed science. And she says, yeah, but my geography teacher said when I was like 7 in 1932, the amount of energy from the sun changes anyway, so it's probably just that, isn't it? Well, no, it's categorically not that, because we've got empirically observed understanding of energy incoming into our planetary system and temperature. And while there is definitely a relationship, this is part of it, the idea that this fully explains the unprecedented recent warming is not particularly, I don't have a particularly high amount of confidence in that theory. So, yeah. So that's the sort of situation as far as the basic science works. I haven't sort of talked about the implications of this for us in this session, because that's all online. So hopefully you can piece together these things. But what I wanted to do was to spend some time talking about our governance response, because that's something that we're going to be focusing on as part of the module, as you know. So the concern with this, goes way back. As I said, the foundational science was kind of published about in the mid-19th century. After the Second World War, with the agenda of human development and poverty reduction, environment becomes an issue, and from that point there is a sort of a growing concern through into the 1990s about the possibility of global warming. And in 1994 there was a key event. So the United Nations got together the Convention on Climate Change, and this kind of sets the foundation for all United Nations work and action. And I've pulled out a bit of the quote which explained why they thought this was important in 1994. So it was about making adjustments, but not just in the abstract sense. It was to ensure that ecosystems could adapt naturally. Because we know, don't we, from our foundational ecological understanding, that the distribution and abundance of species is partly determined by conditions, i.e. kind of temperature, pH, that type of thing. And we know that species can adapt to changes in situations and all sorts of other interaction differences. And they have a certain range of tolerance. And this can shift, but it's kind of an elastic thing. If you stretch it too quickly, it breaks and species can't adapt, and that's why they become extinct and hence play into biodiversity loss. So this is the first important bit. The second bit that I think is particularly important is in 1994, the United Nations and all the advisors said, one of the reasons we're a bit worried about this is because if the temperature changes, if the conditions change, one of the species on Earth, or many of the species on Earth, are used for human food. If those species can't survive or thrive and have the same kind of yield levels, this is going to compromise human food security. So one of the express concerns in '94 was that if this gets out of control, it'll compromise the food availability and very much compromise the safe operating space for human development. Remember that when you engage with the Moodle materials and when I talk about what I think the concerning impacts of the climate emergency are for us via food. So, prompted by some pretty serious concerns, the United Nations established a thing called the Conference of the Parties, referred to as COP. I know a lot of you are involved in lots of climate things. Does anyone have a sense of what the Conference of the Parties is? Please. Yes. So the Conference of the Parties, it's the kind of the parties that signed up to the Climate Change Convention, and they meet annually, and they talk about stuff. They talk about the nature of the science and where we're at, and they talk about taking action, and the other thing they do is talk about getting money, because their sort of the long-term aspiration was that at this stage they wanted greenhouse gas emissions, human-created, to be less in the year 2000 than they were in 1990. So this was the sort of the overall framework. They set up the thing called the Global Environmental Facility, which was a sort of a trust fund of money that would be donated to by the countries that had the capacity to help countries with lesser capacity to also participate in action around climate change. They also set up 3 governance mechanisms to try to bring about change. And I think it's interesting that they chose, well, some of the mechanisms they chose were market-based. So they set up an international emissions trading scheme, and it said, basically, if we start to think about limiting countries' emissions, and a country limits its emissions way more than it's supposed to, it can kind of sell those credits to another country that isn't quite going to meet its emissions. And this will create a better set of incentives. So you can, if you do really well, you can kind of sell that credit to someone else for money, and that'll incentivize action. It also has the opposite effect. So if you know that you can buy some credits and you don't have to try as hard on the climate change greenhouse gas thing, it provides a safety valve. So maybe it's a double-edged sword. Clean Development Mechanism was about helping technology transfers, particularly more developed, economically developed, and the developing world. And the idea of joint implementation, so if richer countries could set up projects in more economically developing countries, which would help them with their carbon and their greenhouse gas emissions, but also kind of get credit for the country investing, so in a joint program. So when we talked about governance options, we can see in here, this is the international community using those market mechanisms in various ways. Something you might have heard of, and maybe at some point this week you'll read about, is the Kyoto Protocol. Does anyone just off the top of their heads have anything brief that they could share with us about this, please?
The Kyoto Protocol was what the Paris Agreement was originally set back early, more colonial time, and so it put in protocols such as what the Paris Agreement tried to do, which was get all countries involved. However, a lot of people would see it as being very much a failure.
Yeah, nice. So this was an attempt to sort of go beyond the market mechanism to start using regulatory mechanisms to say, okay, countries need to reduce their emissions and by this much. It was adopted 97. and only got kind of ratified by all the Conference of the Parties in 2005, so a little under 10 years. The reason for this, as you'll be reading about and we'll talk about, is it's complicated, because at this point, we're asking people to change their behaviours, we're asking national governments to restrict potentially, or at least to start thinking about how economic growth might need to be balanced against another metric, and that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this took a while. Just to give you an example of the sorts of agreements that countries reached and committed to, so the UK said that it would reduce its emissions by the year 2000, the emissions would be 92% of what they were in 1990, so an 8% reduction. And for some greenhouse gases, the benchmark was taken as 1990. For others, 1995, because they didn't quite have the data set and it took a bit of time. So that's the fundamental idea. It's important to note that this was seen as a responsibility of the more economically developed countries and also transition countries that were moving away from being part of the Soviet Union and were marketizing. Later on, we had an amendment because we were getting kind of close to the end. So the period got extended, so the target year became 2020, and countries pushed the percentage commitments more. So the UK said, okay, we'll do a 10% reduction by 2020, so we'll hit 80% of our 1990 emissions. So this is the kind of the big background context. Something that happened more recently, so maybe you're likely to know more about, is the Paris Agreement. So this was kind of another update. Does anyone have any thoughts about what this was about? And anything that came out of it? Maybe some of you went. Jenny? Yeah. Lois, you...
A lot of it, looking back on it now in hindsight, a lot of it is looking at actually it was kind of useless because it only said for countries to agree, oh yeah, we'll do something about that, but actually it doesn't actually make any countries do anything about it. So it was more of a political publicity statement than actually working. Yeah. So this is the Paris Agreement also has legally binding parts. But they're not all legally binding. So sort of one of the legally binding bits was kind of, we agree that this is really bad, and what we need to do is to limit warming to below 2 degrees, and ideally to 1.5 degrees. We legally commit to this intellectual idea, if you like. As part of this, it was agreed that countries need to do everything they possibly can to bring emissions to zero by around the mid-century, so 2050. But as Lois says, instead of countries sort of negotiating with the central organisation, if you like, all they had to do was to agree to come up with their own targets. So these are known as the nationally determined contributions. So the representatives went away from the central negotiations back to their kind of domestic legislative processes and then decided what they were going to commit to. And on the plus side, this is more flexible. It meant that the Paris Agreement could be sort of overwhelmingly supported, but ultimately there was no legally binding targets set there and then. It was up to countries to do it themselves. And that provides the other side of the sword, which hopefully you'll read about in the literature. So I just want to talk about the UK as a bit of a case study. It's interesting. So the UK CO2 emissions, they peaked in the 1970s. So going into all of this, the UK government and representatives already knew that emissions were coming down. So this was quite a sweet situation. But I think, we could make an argument that there's a positive record for the UK. These are greenhouse gas emissions, 1990s, coming through to 2020, and this is the government's own data. So if we look at what was happening in 1990, compare it with 2000, which was the target, we can see that, yay, the United Kingdom, the emissions in 2000 was definitely less than 1990. Great stuff. 30 years later, 2020,
we've got a 48% reduction from the sort of the 1990 reference period. So this seems pretty good. So then if we are thinking about the sort of the Doha commitments and what have you, the UK has now got 10 years until 2030 to reduce another 20%, so that would take it to the 68% reduction commitment. So what's that like? Just under 50% in 30 years. Now we've got 10 years to do 20%. It's not going to be easy. But this story, yeah, so far is quite positive. And therefore, I think it's worth looking at. So this is, again, UK government data. This is the breakdown of where greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced in different parts of the economy. I'm going to cut off the last bit, because it's cheating, because that was the COVID pandemic when the economy crashed and no one went to work or drove around or did anything for like 2 years. So let's well, not imagine. We know that that has bounced back, so that's not real. So looking at this data, hopefully you can see the major drop is the yellow line, and the yellow line is electricity supply. So the UK has made quite significant achievements. So 36% of its savings from 2000 to now, is that right? Yes, so 2019, no. Yeah, 2000 until now, 36% has come from changing the energy mix. So we've moved away from, well, actually, I'll talk about that in a second. We've used away from fossil fuels and done other things. Other significant sectors, so construction, has saved an awful lot of greenhouse gases. We can see the blue line, so our management of waste has dropped initially, but is now kind of plateauing out. So that's something to maybe pique our interest. And also the building infrastructure. So the red line, it's zigzagged up and down, but it kind of dropped initially quite strongly. But now it's starting to plateau. And there are, yeah, interesting reasons for that. So we might look at this and say, okay, how does this help us understand the place we're currently at? If we just look at the energy mix for the UK, so the black line is that energy provided by coal. And as we can see very recently from 2013 or something, the use of coal has dropped off significantly. And this is a big contributor to saving the UK greenhouse gas contributions. We can see renewables rising. We can see the use of gas rising. It's still a fossil fuel, but it has less greenhouse gas emissions per unit of energy. So it's more efficient, although it's not by any means like an answer. If we look at projecting forward for the UK, so in 2008, the UK adopted the Climate Change Act. So this was like internalising the international expectations. So it set a series of carbon budgets, targets to hit, and then this allowed planning as to how we were going to do that as a country. Interestingly, for governance, it set up an independent commission to monitor progress and to check and to advise the government on the most appropriate policies. And what we've seen here is the progress of the UK has kind of tracked to the budgets. But if we look forward, so the first budget, yes, we made that, great stuff. The second budget, we made that, great stuff. The third budget, so that's the one just kind of rounding off about now. Data suggests that's been hit. The next budget, we're not on target for, according to the Independent Committee on Climate Change, and the story doesn't get any better from there. It's particularly problematic because for all the previous 5 budgets here, for some reason we decided we didn't want to include international shipping and aviation. Can't think why, unless I think about it for more than like a second, and then I can. But suddenly, in the 6th budget, that's going to be included. Yet, the expected drop is bigger than it's ever been, but the thing we're looking at is even bigger. A lot of people are looking at that and saying, this doesn't make any sense at all. So the whole pathway to net zero is problematic, to say the least. There's some other problems. All the data at the moment, so it's part of this exclusion of shipping and aviation. So all the emissions at the moment, based on international standards, are about terrestrial emissions. So what are the greenhouse gases coming out of the land space that is Britain? But if you think about that, and you realise how much stuff Britain imports from other parts of the world, you realise that the ability of Britain to maintain the lives and welfare of its citizens is not entirely nationalised, let's say. So if we then shift the metric and we say, well, actually, what's the real carbon and greenhouse gas footprint of life in Britain? We get a new line, which is way higher than the line that was getting used in the 1990s. And it's way higher, and it stays way higher. And if we look at changes for this, it's suddenly a bit less impressive because, so remember the aspiration that in 2000, the figure would be less than 1990. Well, yeah, okay, it sort of drops in the mid-1990s, the blue line there, but then it bounces back up. And it was higher in the year 2000. And really, substantial change doesn't start to happen until, what, 2007? So when you talk about what actually matters, the actual contribution of greenhouse gases to our planetary system, not so positive. It gets much worse. So the UK government have been using data that they know is misrepresentative for decades, years, and they justify it by saying, oh, there's the international community, that's what they do. So there's no thought leadership here. There's no actually using the science. It's being happy to go along with something that suits them. And this meant that in 2019, the British Prime Minister could lead the world. Britain was the first country to commit legally to net zero by 2050. Theresa May hoped that she would go down in history for this, and it would be a great contribution. There were some interesting details if people bothered to look into footnotes. Thank God for academics, eh? And journalists. So this whole thing was based upon the IPCC predictions, which you'll learn a bit about in the online materials, from 2014. So quite old. And they said that if we're going to avoid anything above 1.5 degree rise, the global net neutrality has to happen by 2070. And Britain, or parts of the British administration, said, well, we think Britain started the Industrial Revolution and we are historically responsible for a good proportion of what's happened to date. So it's completely unreasonable for us to set 2070 as our net zero. We will commit to 2050. This was sound science, this was moral, this was leadership. In 2018, the IPCC said, it's way worse than we thought. Actually, if we're going to have any chance of getting under 1.5 degrees, we need global net neutrality by 2050. The logical, moral, intellectually robust decision would have been to say, okay, UK net neutrality has to come forward by at least, what, a year, 2 years, 5? Come on. But they didn't. They just pretended that didn't happen and pretended that this was still something worth celebrating. And what this means is that everything subsequently is bollocks. It's based upon an assumption that's not backed by the science. And that's not how you do good governance. Boris Johnson tried to rescue Britain last year when Glasgow hosted the COP26, so Conference of the Parties, the 26th meeting, and he said we have to act now before it's too late. It would have been better for Britain to have acted 20 years ago before it was too late, but never mind. And everyone was focused on the 1.5 degree target from Paris. How can we make this happen? But the thing is, it was already irrelevant. We already knew that Britain wasn't going to hit or help hit the 1.5 degree unless it committed to something better than net neutrality by 2050. So any conversations that happened on this assumption were out of line with the science. They were not sufficient. They were not rigorous. So just to try and put this in context quickly. Well, this is Britain about here in the emissions per capita, which is arguably the fairest way of thinking about it. We know that Britain has already achieved a lot of its saving through changing the energy mix. But that option has gone now. That relatively easy fruit has been picked. Where Britain goes from now is more complicated. But let's move up the scale. If we look at China, we can see that China does use a lot of coal for its energy production. And actually, extrapolating forward based on what China has committed to, etc., we don't see a huge amount of change. So there's potential there at the global level. But per head of population, if you look at the comparative kind of wealth and capacity, you've got to think about it critically. Let's look at the US. So the biggest emitter the biggest country, not the biggest emitter per head of population, but a most significant emitter with a high level of emissions per capita. They've already also, a bit like Britain, despite what gets talked about Trump and bringing coal back, they've narrowed it down quite a lot by 2020. So there is more could be done than is predicted to change. But you've got to ask, if the US are going to make further contributions, where's it going to come from? It's not really reducing coal, because again, that fruit's been picked. This is a really narrow insight into the whole thing, but the argument I'm making is that the work we've done has been the easy work, and now it's getting a lot harder. And the whole thing is premised on the wrong information. And don't believe me, believe the independent, the carbon action, which is scientifically backed independent assessment. And they say that after Glasgow, the glorious COP26, at the moment, policies and actions look like we're talking about a 2.7% rise. Or maybe a 3.6% rise at the worst case scenario. Based on the 2030 targets, we're talking about 2.4, but maybe 3. If we look at the pledges that have been made, we're still looking at 2.1 or 2.6. So anyone who tells you, oh, wasn't COP a great success? Maybe there's a chance of getting to 1.5. You've got to ask them what they're talking about. The prediction, the commitments that countries could manage to propose aren't sufficient. And then we have to ask questions about, well, what's the difference between what gets promised and what gets delivered? And there's not a great historical record. Well, no, that's not true. There's reasons to question that. This is what you're looking at. Your world is most likely to be 2.1 degrees hotter than it was in the Industrial Revolution. Better let you go. But Britain, in the same week as announcing all of this, also said, I tell you what, let's reduce tax on aviation fuel. It'll help the economy. We'll worry about the climate later. It's planning to adapt to a warmer Britain. It makes sense, but it's going to happen. And I will leave the final bit to a short video, which I'll post a bit later in the week, because I want to talk to you about it, but I need to let you go. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the week. It can only get more uplifting.